There's an increasing interest in shiitake mushroom production throughout the United States. States such as Kentucky and its neighbors bordering the Appalachian mountain chain should take a serious look at this forest-oriented crop for a number of sound economic and environmental reasons. First, you can grow shiitake mushrooms on almost any kind of hardwood log. This fits in well with the vast majority of Kentucky landowners because most small acreages in the state contain some forested areas, and all of them need some kind of management, which may include thinning out some smaller diameter trees. Veteran shiitake producers also emphasize that we get a far better product from natural logs than from forms created out of pressed sawdust. One misconception that needs correcting is that only oak tree species are capable of growing shiitake mushrooms. In fact, many other tree species actually produce a flush of mushrooms more rapidly than either red or white oak. If you plan on getting shiitake logs from your own woodlot, it's suggested that you begin by removing the smaller or crooked hardwood tree species that have no commercial value. Look for overcrowded areas and clumps of trees surrounding one or two good trees. The logs need to be about the same size for easier stacking. It's suggested that logs be 3 to 6 inches in diameter and from 3 to 4 feet in length. Decide on a size that you can comfortably handle. You may be able to purchase the right size logs from ongoing logging operations or through firewood cutters in your area. Branches of commercially logged trees might be the right size for shiitake production. Spawn is the seed of the mushroom, and it must be introduced into the log. Shiitake has been cultivated in the United States for about 25 years, but has not yet shown symptoms of escaping into the wild. Also, it's a fungus that feeds on dead, not living trees. There are 3 typical forms in which spawn can be introduced into the log. The most popular is the sawdust form. A bag of sawdust spawn should be enough to inoculate 5 to 10 logs. The sawdust spawn is broken up by hand and injected into the log with an inoculation tool into drilled holes along the length and around the circumference of the log. Spawn can also be introduced into the log in the form of wooden dowels or thimble forms. Both these forms are hammered into the log, which makes for easier inoculation. Wooden dowels do not provide as much spawn-laden surface area as the sawdust form. Thimble spawn includes a cap, which cuts down on the waxing stage of the inoculation process, but they're expensive and more awkward to store than other types. Thimble spawn must be used immediately because of its potential for quickly drying out. It's best used the day it arrives. The tools needed to inoculate the log include rubber gloves to protect your skin from long exposure to the spawn and to keep organisms on your hands from contaminating the spawn. Alcohol is used to sterilize the drill bits used in creating the plug holes. An X-shaped sawhorse does a good job of holding the logs in place as they're drilled. The entire inoculation process can also be done in an assembly line fashion on a specially designed table. Special drills are available which operate at very high speeds, 4 to 8,000 RPMs. Although initially expensive, these drills will make a dramatic difference in the speed with which holes can be drilled. The expense is justified in operations where many hundreds or thousands of logs are being drilled. A good rule of thumb for the number of rows to be drilled is to use the same number as the number of inches in the diameter of each log. The rows should also be staggered so that the holes of one row will be placed between the holes of the preceding row all around the outside of the log. So distances may have to be adjusted for smaller logs to ensure that you have enough holes. The sawdust and dowel plugs are sealed with a food-quality cheese wax. This melts at a high temperature of 400 degrees, whereas other varieties of wax melt at much lower temperatures. One of the purposes for the higher melting temperature is to sterilize the inoculation site. If the wax temperature is right, it will sizzle and foam as it's applied to the spawn-laden drill holes. If you're going to be processing a lot of logs, or in repeated sequences, it's very important to label them properly. Include information like the month and year of inoculation, the kind of spawn used, and the tree species used. Used pop cans can be cut into strips, and they make excellent aluminum labels. Or regular aluminum labels can be purchased from shiitake suppliers. The amount of moisture in the log is critical. The log must have a moisture content of around 30% all during the growing process. They must be full of moisture to allow proper spread of the inoculum. Logs that are fresh cut in the fall of the year usually contain a maximum amount of moisture and do not need additional moisture. If you decide to force your logs into mushroom production after they've incubated for at least a year, the logs will have to be immersed in water overnight before starting the production process. Smaller operations can use a stock watering tank. Larger operations may need to design larger soak tanks. Various kinds of sprinkling devices can also be used to water groupings of logs, although that can be water wasteful in dry weather. You must have some patience to grow mushrooms. Once they're inoculated, they must be incubated for 6 to 18 months. During the incubation process, the logs may be stacked crib style, lean-to style, or log cabin style. When the logs are stacked close to the ground, they'll be exposed to greater humidity, which will accelerate the incubation process. But close to the ground does not mean contact with the ground. The logs not only can wick up moisture from the soil, but they can also pick up unwanted organisms. During the incubation period, logs will require a good balance of moisture, shade, and air circulation. Incubating logs will need 80 to 90% shade and ideally should be kept in a wooded area. North and east exposures on slopes are cooler and more humid. Use shade cloth if you don't have a wooded area where you can incubate your logs. Happily, pests are a minor issue for shiitake mushroom production. There are some fungi, such as Bulgaria, and bacteria that may occur as competitors, but they usually do not harm the shiitakes. Use of the recommended production techniques greatly protects the growing mushrooms from too much moisture and from insect and animal damage. Squirrels, rabbits, deer, voles, and mice can cause some damage. The best preventative measure is to put your logs in a specific production schedule and harvest your mushrooms as soon as they have reached an optimal size for market. Slugs and small flying insects can cause damage to the mushroom crop, but good management can also resolve most of this damage. For instance, slugs prefer a plate of beer to mushroom meal. When shiitake spawn has occupied the entire log, white mycelia will show up at the ends of the logs. This signals that logs are ready to fruit when they're subjected to warm, moist conditions. They can also be forced into fruiting by immersing them into water overnight. The production cycle is a 9-week process. The forced logs will fruit within a week, starting a few days after soaking. These logs must then rest after production for 8 weeks before they're once again forced into production. To ensure weekly harvest cycles, force 1/9 of your total logs into production each week to keep you on a continuous production schedule. The forcing process begins by submerging the logs. This deprives the log of oxygen and is a key factor in starting the mushroom fruiting process. The logs are then stacked log cabin style with no more. The stack is then covered with a plastic covering with a hole in the top and space at the bottom to ensure good airflow. The covered stack helps control insect and animal damage too. It also produces a cleaner crop of mushrooms, and the mushrooms seem to grow more uniformly along the entire log. When the logs are ready to fruit, they will pin, which means that tiny heads of mushrooms will emerge from anywhere on the log. They are ready to harvest when they have a rounded cap 2 to 3 inches in diameter. The edges of the caps should also be curled under because they will continue to flatten out after harvesting. The mushrooms will have brown caps and a white underside. Sometimes they're honey brown and sometimes a dark chocolate brown on top. Shiitake are also characterized by a ring of white spots near the edge of the cap. Although the mushrooms may be twisted off at their base for harvesting, they are woodier than other varieties, and it will be a lot cleaner operation if you use a paring knife to separate them from the wood. The mushrooms should be placed in well-ventilated boxes with smooth interiors. There are boxes specifically designed for harvesting and transporting shiitake mushrooms, and they're available in a variety of sizes. Shiitake have a shelf life of about 2 weeks, as long as they're refrigerated. They should be cooled within an hour of harvesting.